Dearborn United Methodist Church. And my name is Glenys Nellis, and I am super excited today that you get to meet my friend who we've actually never met, but I'll tell you about it in a minute. But her name is Donna Fowler-Marchant, and she is a United Methodist pastor, and she's written this fabulous book, which you've all got to get, and recommend that your library purchases it. It's called Mothers in Israel, and the subtitle is Methodist, excuse me, Methodist Beginnings Through the Eyes of Women. And it's just a fabulous peek into how the women of Methodism played a pivotal role in just in so many different ways. And so before I read Donna's bio, I'm just going to take 2 minutes and explain how I know Donna, because it's a crazy, like, God story. So Donna and I met on Facebook in a writers group, and so we just said hi, you know, and what do you write and what do you write? And one day I saw that she was going to spend a little bit of time in England, which is where I'm from. And I said, where are you going to minister? And she said, to a place called Watford. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's crazy, because that's where my dad lived for the last 15 years of his life when he got remarried, you know. So I'm like, you'll love it there, bye, you know. Next thing I see, a month later, she turns up in Watford at Croxley Green Methodist Church, the church that my dad went to with Adrienne, his new wonderful wife, and preached there. And she is their pastor now. I'm like, Donna, this is crazy. You're going to meet my stepmom. She's the organist. And so that was just a wonderful God incident that allowed us to be connected. And so I really hope that we'll get to meet one day, but that's how I know Donna. And so right now I'm going to go ahead and read her bio and introduce her to you. So this week's featured author is Donna Fowler-Marchant, author of Mothers in Israel, Methodist Beginnings Through the Eyes of Women, and a Methodist minister currently appointed to a circuit just outside London. A graduate of Meredith College, a women's liberal arts college, Duke University Divinity School, and Wesley Theological Seminary, her interests include exploring women's roles in early Methodist history and highlighting their stories so contemporary people can discover their relevance today. In addition to writing and delivering thousands of sermons, she maintains a regular blog called Travels with Wesley, as well as a Facebook page and an Instagram account of the same name. So everybody go and follow her. This is her first book. Donna is married to Scott Marchant, an electrical engineer with Goodyear, and the couple has 2 adult children whom they adopted from Russia. Sergey, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and Natasha. Donna loves reading, traveling abroad, trying new types of food, preferably cooked by someone else, writing, and listening to all kinds of music. Donna, we are thrilled to welcome you to our little coffee chat today. And would you begin? I know that people are going to have lots of questions for you. I'm excited because I lead a disciple Bible study with about 16 ladies, and we just read the letters of Paul, and they're very hard for women to read and try to make sense of, you know, in this modern world. But I just love your heart for women's ministry, and I'm excited to hear how did you fall in love with John Wesley? How did you start writing? How did that all come about?
Well, first, I just want to say how happy I am to be here, and it's marvelous to see some of my church people here. Again, we're so happy about Zoom bringing all of us together from Michigan to North Carolina to, Hertfordshire. Um, so about John Wesley. Well, I grew up Baptist and was actually ordained Baptist in 1992. I'm coming up on the 29th anniversary of my ordination. But I was at Duke, which of course is a Methodist seminary. And so I was kind of swimming in this Methodist pool, if you will. And over the years, I came to realize that my theology was really very Wesleyan because of the emphasis on grace, primarily. And one of my professors who taught me undergrad and at Duke Divinity School, she always kind of had this feeling like I was going to wind up becoming Methodist. And she would say that, and I would be like, oh, no, I'm sure that's not going to happen. But the more that I read of Wesley's theology, and of course, I've been singing Charles Wesley hymns my whole life, I realized that she was right. And so I started serving a 2-point charge in rural North Carolina in 1996. And I was there for 3 years and then was sent to Fayetteville, which is where I am now. I've been here since the summer of 1999, and I've served in big churches, I've served in small churches, I've done rural and I've done urban. And then the last 8 years that I was before I went to England, I was at a Presbyterian church. So that was kind of a great background for me going to England, because one of the churches that I'm assigned to is what they call an LEP, and it's United Reformed, which is very Presbyterian, with a Methodist church. So I get to kind of combine all of those pieces together. So while I was at this Presbyterian church, I went on a pilgrimage to England in 2016 to do all the Wesley stuff in England, and it just kind of fired up that interest that I'd had in women's history and in Methodist history in particular. One of my master's degrees was a THM in church history, so I've always been interested in that, and always, partly because of going to a women's college, and partly just because you sometimes want to hear those voices that don't often get heard. I just wanted to hear what women had to say and what part they had played, and a lot of times we don't hear that. The stories either haven't been recorded, or they might have been recorded, but they were massaged in such a way that the women didn't seem quite so radical. And so while I was on that pilgrimage, I just got fired up again about thinking about women in Methodism. And Paul Chilcote, who's kind of the name who's written about women in Methodism, was one of the people on the pilgrimage. And, talking to him, he was kind of one of my heroes. So that sort of got me fired up about it again. And I decided to ask to be allowed to do a sabbatical the next summer. So I spent the summer of 2017 in the UK, traveling around to some of those Methodist places again. So I was at Wesley's Chapel in London for a little while. I was at the New Room in Bristol for a little while. I spent 2 weeks in Epworth, and they were so funny. They said, nobody comes here and spends 2 weeks. And I said, well, I do. I'm here visiting the Wesleys. So I got to do that. And I spent about a week and a half in Manchester at the John Rylands Library, at the Methodist Archives, and I got to see letters that had been written to and from the Wesleys, letters that Susanna Wesley had written, letters that some of the Methodist women had written, and I got to see some of Charles Wesley's actual manuscripts of some of his hymns. So all of that was just very exciting, and I thought, well, I really want to do something with this. It's great to know it, but if you don't put it to some use, it's sort of pointless. So I started, messing around with the idea, well, I think I'll write a book. Well, unless you have somebody, well, I don't know, you may be a lot more self-disciplined than I am, but I need somebody to sort of poke me a little bit. So I just sort of fiddled around with it a little bit and didn't really get serious about it. And I was writing about it in my blog, and I kept saying, oh, I'm going to write this book about women in Methodism. And one of the editors at the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry contacted me, and she said, I've been reading your blog, I've been looking at you on Facebook, and I see that you want to write a book. Let's talk. So she and I had some conversations, and she helped me really kind of narrow it down, because at first I was interested in looking at how John Wesley did spiritual direction with women through his letters. But then I decided that, as interesting as that was, I wanted to look a little more at the women themselves and their relationships, and what was it that maybe they had in common that allowed them to be these courageous leaders. So that's kind of where all that went. And then the pandemic hit when I had done probably about 95% of the research I wanted to do. I was planning to go back up to Duke the day that everything sort of shut down. And I said, oh, that's terrible. I'm not going to be able to do the book. But I had done so much research and I bought so many books that, it may not have been the book I'd intended, but it came pretty close. So that's kind of how I got interested in all of that. And one of my friends in Bristol can sew and knit and do just absolutely everything. And she made me this marvelous little knitted John Wesley. And he's sort of become my little keepsake. He pops up in pictures regularly. And so he's been sort of my little inspiration who sat on my shoulder, if you will, while I've been working on the book and afterwards. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how all that stuff came together.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great story, Donna. And I love your little John Wesley stuff there. Susanna Wesley would like that, wouldn't she?
I wonder what she would think about that.
I don't know, because she was a remarkable woman. And that, of course, that is where your book begins, isn't it? It has to begin with Susanna Wesley, the mother of Charles and John and several more children. And so I wanted to ask you, what, in your research about Susanna Wesley, what did you learn that was just amazing to you or fascinating to you, or that you didn't know before? What impacts you about her story? Because she was wonderful, wasn't she?
She really was. She was an incredible woman for her time and for any time, really. I think a lot of people know about Susanna because she's the mother of John and Charles, and she's been called the mother of Methodism because of that. But she deserves that title for way more than just simply being known as their mother. Susanna was a very highly educated woman for her time. Her father was a very well-known Presbyterian minister, and he gave her free reign of his library when she was growing up, which is pretty unusual for the 17th century. And so when she was only 12 years old, she read kind of arguments for being in his Puritan Presbyterian tradition and arguments for being part of the Church of England. And she decided at the age of 12 that she really needed to be part of the Church of England. And as I said, her father was very well known. He could have taken, great umbrage at that, but he didn't. He supported her in her decision. And so she became a member of the Church of England. So that tells you a little bit about the sort of deep piety that she had even from a young age, and that very independent spirit. So that's very key, I think, to know about Susanna, because that never went away. And you see that in her interactions throughout her life, particularly in her marriage to Samuel Wesley. And it was a very sort of tempestuous marriage, if you will. They married when she was 19 and he was a few years older. Or no, maybe she was 18. But anyway, she was quite young and he was a few years older. And she gave birth to 19 children, which is just mind-boggling. I mean, some of those were sets of twins, but even so, that's a lot of children and a lot of years of being pregnant. And 10 of the children survived infancy. And she raised them at home, did her other schooling at home. And she was unusual for her day, that she wanted her daughters, of whom there were 7, to be able to read and to write before they started doing womanly things like sewing or, any of those household sorts of things. Very unusual for her time. And so she very methodically set up a schedule of what they did during their school hours. They had a break in the middle and so forth. So she was teaching them not just, reading and writing and basic skills like that. She was instructing her children in the things of God. And she believed that that was her main goal of her life, was to do good to her children's souls. And that desire to do good to their souls spilled out into a wider sort of ministry, even beyond the household, because Samuel Wesley was away in London for convocation with the Church of England. And so in his absence, he left his curate, Mr. Inman, in charge of things at the church. And by all accounts, Mr. Inman was a dull preacher. And so people started finding excuses not to go to church because they just didn't really want to hear Mr. Inman because he preached about the same thing over and over. And Susanna, of course, was having evening devotions with her family and her household. And so people started knocking on the door at the rectory saying, can we come join in? And so she was having these prayer meetings basically around her kitchen table. And it eventually turned up to some 200 people kind of crammed into that area around there. And it's not a huge kitchen. I don't know where they all would have fitted in, but pre-COVID they didn't have to worry about social distancing, I guess. But she was having these prayer meetings in the kitchen in the rectory there. She would read sermons from the book of sermons that were part of the Church of England. If a person wasn't there to preach one Sunday, there were standard sermons which someone could stand up and read. So she was doing that, in effect preaching to them. She was, directing their evening prayers and so forth. Well, we think, great, that's marvelous. Well, Mr. Inman did not think this was marvelous because he thought that she was taking people away from the church. And so he wrote a letter to Samuel Wesley basically saying, you need to tell her to stop doing this. So Samuel wrote to her, what are you doing? This looks very strange. This is not what people do that are part of the Church of England. And she wrote him back she was such a logical woman. She wrote him back this very kind of point by point letter telling him the reasons why she was doing it and telling him the good fruit that she was seeing from it, which was contrary to what Mr. Inman was saying. More people were going back to church that had not been going because she was encouraging them to. People were growing in their spiritual journey, and it was promoting really good relations between the rectory and the community, which had not always been the case because Samuel was not a very popular priest. So she's telling him all this, and she told him the reason she wanted to do it was because she'd read a biography of some Danish missionaries. And when she read about what they were doing for God, she said, I wanted to do more than what I was doing. And so she said, I admit that it looks particular. We would say peculiar. It looks particular, but she said, don't most things of God look that way by people who don't know better, basically. So apparently Samuel wrote her back and he said, oh, well, okay, I see what you're saying. That's great. Carry on. Well, she did carry on. And Mr. Inman wrote another letter to Samuel complaining. And so Samuel wrote back to her again, a little more forcefully. And the letter that she wrote back to him was, again, she basically was saying, okay, I told you all this before and you didn't listen. I'm going to tell you again. And so she went through it point by point again. And she wound up by saying to him, if you don't want me to do this, you're going to have to command me not to do this. And you're going to be responsible when we stand before the judgment seat for telling me not to do good to people's souls. So, of course, he backed down. I mean, who wouldn't after that sort of thing? So, again, you see that independence of conscience that she had and that desire to do what she was called to do by God, even if it looked particular, even if it went against her husband, who she had promised to obey in her vows, as they did back then, even if it was something that didn't look normal for the Church of England. And so, John and Charles, well, Charles was very small, but John was old enough to sort of see what was going on there. He was in these meetings, seeing his mother leading these other people. And I am going to have to I'm going to have to plug my computer in because my battery's low. Hold that thought.
Yeah, please do. Plug your computer in.
There we go. Yeah, it just flashed up a warning and I thought, oh dear, this is not good. But anyway, it had a big influence on John Wesley because he saw a woman in leadership, a woman who was pious and devout and very courageous. And that theme carried over in her marriage to Samuel in other ways as well. So it would be very strange if John and Charles had grown up thinking that women couldn't be in some form of leadership, which is not to say that it didn't take a long process for him to get to where he was comfortable with them leading in some of these other very direct ways. But the seeds of that were definitely planted in the rectory with his mother.
Right. And it's just a fascinating peek into that whole struggle, that whole journey of women to find their voice, either as preachers or writers even. I was kind of shocked at one point to read in your book that a lot of the women, the early preachers, Susanna among them, and Mary Bosanquet Fletcher, who is the next woman who you talk about, who was married to one of Wesley's friends, but how they wrote in their journals and how they were great writers, but their writing, listen to this folks, their writing was taken by men and edited, and any parts that were deemed not appropriate to be read at that time were taken out. And that is tragic, isn't it, that their stories were controlled, not just their voice, but their stories on page were controlled in that way. That was kind of a shock for me to read that, but yet their voice still came through loud and clear, and eventually, of course, we know that women were allowed to preach. So David is asking, he says, was Susanna ever allowed to preach?
She didn't necessarily preach in the way we would call it preaching, but yes, she did, because she was reading those sermons and that was considered preaching, as well as she would explain to them what all that stuff meant. So it was probably more in the sense of what they would have called expounding upon theological thoughts in scripture. But there's a very fine line between expounding and preaching, which John later on was trying to keep a very, very good line between those two things, and he didn't succeed too well. He finally had to back down and say, yeah, women were preaching. But yeah, in that sense, Susanna did, and that's what this picture is on the cover of the book. This is Susanna in her kitchen meetings preaching to the people of Epworth and to her household. And I just think I didn't get to choose the picture, but when they sent it to me and said, this is what we want to put on the cover, I said, that's absolutely perfect, because you see that there are men, there are women, and there are children present. So you see that far reach of her expounding and preaching and leading in prayer. So yeah, great question.
Right, and that picture, so David also mentions, but I think we know now that, so that's where the kitchen, that's where Susanna also taught her children, correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, she taught them in the kitchen. Wow. And I've never been to Epworth. David has been, but it just makes me want to go all the more now and see that kitchen and just be in the presence of where the seeds of Methodism were sown by Susanna Wesley.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, now, friends, I want to remind you, if you have questions for Donna, to go ahead and put them in the chat. But in a minute, after this next question, some people are not comfortable with that chat function, and so after this next one, I'll take a peek and see. Just raise your hand, and we can go ahead and ask questions that way too. But right, so this again from David. This is a good one though. This is something you don't touch on in your book, but it's kind of fascinating and funny to us, and I'm sure you're going to know the answer. So maybe you saw it already in the chat. But so John Wesley, we know that John Wesley didn't have very good relationships with women, did he? He wasn't very successful, bless him, in his. I mean, he had a lot of women friends, but like his marriage. So David mentions a lady called Sophie Hopkey, and his wife, I believe his wife was seen, Donna knows, because and his wife was called Molly. So tell us about that, because relationships, it's tell us about Sophie Hopkey, David. You can hear him, can't you? He's laughing.
I can also see him. He's laughing. I see that.
It's a funny story.
It's a funny thing about John Wesley, because the people he was closest to and really could be himself with tended to be women. He had 7 sisters and grew up with mostly women, so he was very comfortable with women. He understood, I think, a lot of times better than some men did about the limitations that society placed on them. But he was just not very good in the romance department. And when he was in Georgia, for the brief time that he was in the colony of Georgia, he fell in love with a young woman named Sophie Hopkey. And incidentally, that's what we named our cat. So so we talk about Sophie Hopkey quite a bit at our house. But he fell in love with this young woman, and he wanted to marry her, but there was part of him that he thought that he needed to be celibate if he was a priest. And so he was really kind of fighting against that, wanting to be married and have a family like everybody else did, and being celibate. And so he was back and forth. He was very wishy-washy about it. And Sophie was a lot younger than him, and she was kind of, well, yeah, no, yeah, no. So anyway, she wound up marrying another man. And John was absolutely heartbroken, and he wrote about it in his journal that, the sun had set forever, and you just really, really brokenhearted about it. And then when she and her new husband came to church and came up to receive communion shortly after the marriage, he refused to give her communion. And he was right on a technicality, because there was a rubric in the Church of England that if you didn't present yourself in the week prior to and tell the priest you wanted to receive communion, then they could turn you away. But he had done that to other people, but he didn't always do it. So I think his hurt feelings played a bit of a part into that. And so this caused a great uproar. It was seen as very insulting to her, and her uncle was kind of the big guy in the political scene in Savannah at the time. And so John basically got run out of Georgia because of this, and went back to England just really in despair, I suppose you'd say. He later fell in love with one of the women who was a class leader. She was one of the housekeepers in one of the centers of Methodism in Newcastle, and she became a preacher, Grace Murray. And I think maybe if they had married, it would have been okay. I mean, John wouldn't have been an easy person to be married to. He was very, sure that he was right all the time, and that would be really hard to live with, I think. And also, he was never home. I mean, he was traveling all the time. That's why I named my blog Travels with Wesley, because that was what he was always doing. But Charles intervened and saw to it that John couldn't marry Grace Murray, and saw to it that she married someone else that she'd sort of been in a relationship with. And John was absolutely devastated. And so it was a major breach between him and Charles that never fully healed. And then about 2 years after that, he met a woman in sort of whirlwind romance, this woman, Molly Vizelle, and that saying about marrying in haste and repenting in leisure. Well, it was true for them. They had a horrible marriage because he was gone all the time. She had a very jealous temperament. And so they didn't live happily together. And she left him several times and would come back. And then finally, they just were separated completely. And he didn't even know that she had died until about a week after she did die. So it's quite sad, because in some ways he was very good with women, but then, as a life partner, not so much.
I know it is kind of, that is a sad part of Wesley's story, really. But David's favourite little tidbit was that apparently John Wesley wrote in his journal that he took Sophie Hopkins in a cornfield, and read the book of Romans to her. And David always says she was looking for romance, not Romans, So
I think that's probably true.
yeah. All right, Donna, we have a little request here from one of our church members. Beth is also an author, and she'll be visiting us in 2 weeks' time.
Great.
But it's always fun to hear our authors read a little excerpt from their book. So is there something, a paragraph, a part that I was actually going to read a bit from the conclusion, because I just love the way the book finishes. But do you have a part that you'd like to read to us?
Yeah, sure. And this is not about Susanna. This is about Mary Basinki Fletcher. So this is a little different. And unlike the last two authors, who were children's authors and had beautiful illustrations, I don't have any pictures to show you. So you're just going to have to imagine the scene, I suppose. Glennis talked a little bit about Mary. She was a remarkable woman. She was, like Susanna, had a very strong, independent conscience. Like Susanna, she did things that weren't considered very womanly because she felt called to do them. And that included being, to her great sorrow, disobedient to her parents, who told her not to be preaching that Methodist stuff to her little brothers. And they wound up telling her she couldn't stay at home with them if she was going to do that. And so, to her sorrow and theirs, she did. But she became a very good friend of John Wesley, and she had this network of women, this circle of other women who were preachers and exhorters and class leaders. And they some of them lived together in community. They had a family, and she was sort of the mother of their family. And when she in 1771, she wrote a letter to Wesley, basically setting out kind of in Q&A reasons why it was okay for women to be preaching. And it was very clever the way she did it, because she worded it in such a way that she was saying, I know it's right, but I want to get your stamp of approval on it as kind of our leader here. And he was absolutely convinced by what she said. And it was very pivotal. And then, she received a lot of pushback about this. I mean, men tried to break down the door of her house to break up one of their class meetings. And she very boldly kind of faced off with them and said, come in here and worship with us. And some of them were, just, embarrassed, and they walked away, and some of them did join. But anyway, she was also told by some people that if she thought she should preach, why didn't she join the Quakers? And she said that while the Quakers indeed have a good deal of God among them, she believes that, and this is a quote, the Lord is more at work among the Methodists. And while I see this, though they were to toss me about as a football, I would stick to them like a leech. Besides, I do nothing but what Mr. Wesley approves. And as to reproach thrown by some on me, what have I to do with it, but quietly go forward, saying, I will be still more vile if my Lord requires it. Indeed, for none but thee, my Lord, would I take up this sore cross. But thou hast done more for me. Only make me holy, and then lead me as thou wilt. That is a really powerful statement for a woman in the 18th century to make. She was called impudent. She was told she was unwomanly. You name it, it was said to her. And that was very difficult to hear, because she had been raised, like most of the women of that time, to be, kind of meek and submissive. And yet, even though she found that very difficult, the ties with her family being frayed by this, people, making fun of her and oppressing her and threatening her. I just love that. She used that phrase that Wesley used about his field preaching, about being more vile. I will be still more vile if my Lord requires it. And so that's one of the things that I love about these women, was that they were so courageous. They were filled with holy boldness, and, they did it. So I think to myself sometimes, if somebody criticizes me or whatever, that is nothing compared to what they did, and they persevered and they went on because they knew that the Spirit of God was upon them. So I gain a lot of comforting and hopefully derive courage from their example from that.
Absolutely, that's right. And I noticed that your Twitter handle is still more vile.
Yes,
right?
And that's why. It's because of Mary. Yep.
Yeah, I know. It's wonderful. So I'm just going to take a peek now and see, does anybody
have a question for Donna? I have another question. I see that it's like coming up 7 minutes past noon, and we're not, as Kirsten said, we're not really worried about time. And if people need to leave, you're certainly welcome. But does anybody have a question for Donna? You just go ahead and raise your hand if you do. And I just have to flick screens. We have a lot of people on today listening to you, Donna, which is wonderful.
That's exciting.
I know, but it just means I have to swipe my screen, to make sure I don't leave anyone out. All right, well, I don't see any hands, but if you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand as Donna is answering this question, and I will call on you. But so Donna, people ask me a lot, what do you hope your readers will gain from your book? So what is your hope? I mean, I tell you, one of my hopes for your book is that it won't just be read by women, that men need to read this book, because it's just fascinating. I think it was really clever the way it's quite factual. There's a lot of facts and a lot of history, but you make it readable. So it's like professional but personable, and I really love that about it. So what do you hope that readers will take from your book?
Well, you hit the nail on the head with that. I wanted it to be academic enough that people saw that I'd done the research. This wasn't just somebody sitting down and saying, oh, I'm going to write a book and, making up stories, that I can back it up with the research. But I also wanted it to be accessible to lay people as well as to clergy. And as you said, to men as well as women, because I think it is really important for people to know that women in leadership in Methodism women preaching in Methodism is not some anomaly. It's not some new thing. It's not something that somebody concocted to try to raise a controversy. This is part of who we are. And it's part of our spiritual DNA. I mean, this is who we are. Women have been pivotal in Methodism from the very beginning. And in all the places that I've served until this latest appointment in Hertfordshire, in all the places I've gone, I've been either the first or second woman they've ever had as their pastor. And that is a very uncomfortable place to be. And you would think, you know, in the 1990s and 2000s that it wouldn't be that way, but it has been that way. And so I think if people will read the book and understand the huge role that women play in that, we're not a footnote to the history. We're a huge part of the story. If people will read that and they will not only learn about these women, which is the first step, because most people, maybe they know a little bit about Susanna and nothing about the rest of these women. If they will learn about them, I want them to learn from them. I want them to see that these women can be spiritual mentors for them, that they have something to say in 2021, just as they did in the 18th century, to men and to women. And with Wesley himself, because he was so close to so many women, the ones that he was closest to, he would take spiritual counsel and advice from them. And there were other men who would take spiritual advice and counsel from some of these women. And there was a huge number of people who claimed that their conversion and their call to preach was because of hearing the preaching of some of these women. So I just think that there's a lot there that can be learned by everybody, that, you know, it's not just something in the past, it's something that in the past that can inform how we act in the present and in the future.
Yeah, oh, thank you, Donna. I wholeheartedly agree. And
I see Shirley with her hand raised. There are 2 more questions at least in the chat. Are you okay still for a few minutes, Donna?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You're okay. Okay, because so I'm going to invite Shirley to unmute, and then there are 2 questions in the chat that I want to come back to also. Go ahead and unmute, Shirley, and you can ask your question. That's all right. It's one of the joys of Zoom.
We've learned to live with it.
That's right. Hey, Shirley, what we'll do, we'll go to one of the questions in the chat, and I know Ed can help you, and then we'll come back to you. Okay. So Judy Pendleton is asking, here's an interesting question, Donna. Which woman do you most identify with?
That's a great question. I don't know that I necessarily identify with her. I think I'd like to identify with her, but Mary Bosanke Fletcher, because she was, we know so much about her because she wrote so much and because she was held in such high esteem. I loved reading about her kind of inner thoughts about her spiritual journey and the way that in some ways she was very much a mystic. And she had visions and dreams that were very kind of challenging and comforting all at the same time in encouraging her to public ministry. And I've always sort of wanted to be that person who would have, you know, dreams and visions. And I guess occasionally I've had something that might fall into that category, though nothing as dramatic as what she describes. But I love that she spent all these years as a single woman in partnership with these other women doing all these things. And then for 4 brief years was married to John Fletcher. And their marriage was very much almost the same as a clergy couple, because he completely respected her as a partner in ministry, and he supported her preaching. He was, I mean, they were really very equally yoked, if you will. It's the kind of marriage that you would like to think that John Wesley would have had, but didn't. And I have a very happy marriage. My husband's an electrical engineer, so we're not in a clergy couple. But the fact that she had that wonderful relationship with him, I think is also really inspiring and wonderful. But he died, and you know, she had many more years of widowhood. But her ministry carried through being single, being married, being widowed. And I just found her to be fascinating because of the way she persevered through all of these things.
Right, yeah.
Can you muted? You're unmuted now. I am, okay. That's
No?
okay.
So, hey, Shirley, you can go ahead and
Hi.
ask your question.
Ed just saved me, and I enjoyed hearing about the Wesley family, but I'd also like to hear from the title, Women in Israel. If you can give us a little overview of what life is like for them there.
The title Mothers in Israel, thank you. That's a great question to ask. The reason that it's entitled Mothers in Israel is because this is a phrase that Wesley and some of the early Methodists used to talk about these brave Methodist women, to compare them to Deborah in the Old Testament as the judge, because she was called a mother in Israel. And so he was saying that these women that were especially brave and pious and were good leaders, that they were kind of raised up a notch above other people, and so he called them mothers in Israel. So yeah, that's a great question, because if you don't know, it's a strange title. So yeah, thank you for asking that.
Yeah, that was a good question, Shirley. All right, Donna, here we go from Kim. Kim wants to know
what surprised you most about the women in your book?
What surprised me most?
I
think maybe one of the things that particularly surprised me about the women was just how much they helped each other, because they had these webs of kind of interaction and support that were very strong bonds. And I'm thinking particularly about Sarah Ryan, who was one of the housekeepers at the New Room in Bristol. Wesley saw in her gifts that other people had not seen, because she had what some people would consider a very checkered past. She'd been married 3 times and the men never bothered to divorce her in between. You know, she says she had a colorful past that some people held against her. And Wesley saw in her gifts for ministry, she eventually became an exhorter. And she was a very good friend and mentor to Mary Basanki when she was a single woman. And they had a household together. They created this orphanage and educational school for children together. And she looked up to Sarah as her mother, because her relationship with her own mother was so fraught, because her mother was distressed about her being involved with those crazy Methodists. And so it was fascinating to me that that those ties were so strong. And when she died at the age of 44, Sarah Ryan did. Mary was just devastated. And even in the years after her death, she never had that same spiritual friendship, that same level of friendship with anyone else. And when John Fletcher proposed to her, she pretty much told him that even though Sarah was dead, she was still going to be part of their marriage, because she'd been such an important person. And he must have been just an amazing man. He was like, I totally understand that. Let's do it. So that really surprised me. I think that those bonds were that strong, in some cases even stronger than the bonds of biological family, because Mary very much felt that she was mothered by Sarah, and she in turn became a sort of a mother to Sarah's niece Sally, who also became a Methodist exhorter and class leader. So it was really neat to see how all that played out.
Yes, and I think that support system between Methodist women is still so very
strong. Every church I've been in, there is this structure of women supporting women, and that's really wonderful to see. Yeah,
it is.
All right, Donna, this is probably the last question, but I do want to read a tiny part from your conclusion, which really touched me. So this is a question from Kirsten, and she says, this is a great question. What was it like finding records on the lesser known to us, the lesser known women and their contributions? Was that hard to find their stories? I mean, probably there was a lot for you to read about Susanna, but the other lesser known women, was it hard to find their stories and their contributions?
Yes and no. Some of the stuff is in existence, but because of the pandemic, I couldn't get to it. So in that sense, some of it was hard to find. There is a massive amount of stuff in the John Rylands in Manchester that has never fully been gone through. I mean, there's boxes of correspondence and writings between Mary Basanki Fletcher and another of her adoptive daughters, Mary Tooth. And there's no book that's pulled that stuff together. No one's written that up. Nobody's done like an annotated version of Mary's memoirs, because when her memoirs were printed, Henry Moore edited out a bunch of the stuff that he obviously felt very uncomfortable with, which honestly, that just made me so angry reading that, because it was things that were very important to her as a human being, but also as a woman, because she had, in one of her visions, she had a vision that a man came to her and brought her a baby and said, "You need to feed the baby." And she said, "Well, I can't." And he said to her in this vision, you know, "Keep trying," and that she eventually was able to breastfeed this baby. And so basically she saw that as God saying to her, "You can feed my children." That is a very powerful image for all sorts of reasons, very feminine image. And apparently it just freaked Mr. Moore out, because he didn't preserve that in his version of her journal when it came out. And frustratingly, there's so many other women that we don't know much about, because the stuff maybe was written down and it got lost, sometimes deliberately, sometimes just, you know, over the years things have been misplaced, I suppose. But I want to give a shout out to Zechariah Taft. He was married to Mary Barrett Taft, who was a very well-known preacher before their marriage. And he not only would not preach someplace that she wasn't welcome, he compiled a huge 2-volume set of biographies of some of these women that we would know nothing about had he not written that down. And I have been trying really hard to get both of those volumes. I managed to get a copy of, I think it's volume 2, after just scrounging around the internet trying to get it. Have not been able to find a copy of volume 1. There's some, you know, in libraries, but I haven't found one that I could buy. And I think that's a real shame. Why isn't that available? Because we could learn, even though some of that's very secondhand, he would quote large chunks from these women's writings in his 2 volumes. So yeah, it's frustrating because some of the stuff's there, some of the stuff's not there, but it's very hard to get access to it. And you can't just, you know, you can't just roll up to the John Rylands and say, "Hey, I want to look at these letters," or whatever. You have to be kind of accredited as a researcher. And, you know, I didn't feel like I was, but I got some professor friends of mine to kind of write letters ahead of me to say, "She's not going to destroy this stuff. She's not some fruitcake." So I did get, you know, permission to do that. And it was absolutely mind-boggling to actually hold these things and see their handwriting. I mean, it gives me goosebumps now just talking about it.
Oh, yeah, I know it would give me goosebumps too. All right, there are a question as you were talking then.
Came in from Irene Goulding, and she says, "Is that going to be your next book?" Are you referring to the story up to Mary's story, Irene? Yeah, yeah, she's nodding. Is that going? That was one of my questions too. I mean, not that one, but what's next from the pen of Donna Fowler-Marchant?
Well, that's a good question, because as much as I think there's more stories about these women that I'd like to tell, you know, pandemic life has made things absolutely abnormal. And so I'm supposed to be in Hertfordshire with, you know, with my folks there, but I'm not, because I had to come back in November and I haven't been able to return yet. So I think I'm going to be so busy trying to get reacclimated to being back in England when I finally get back there and, you know, working with the churches, that writing may not be the first thing on my agenda. But would I like to tell more of this stuff, and would I like to delve into it? Yeah, absolutely. It was absolutely such a thrill to me to be doing some of this research. I mean, there's some stuff at Duke, and that was great. But I mean, that's where I was in seminary, so it didn't have quite that same sort of, wow, I'm doing this research. But to actually go and be in those archives and as I said, actually hold these letters and stuff, it was, wow. I mean, I was blown away. I'm like, I'm from this little town in North Carolina. I never thought I'd be doing anything like this. And I certainly never thought that I'd be writing a book that, you know, the United Methodist Church would publish. And then, I mean, it's already been mentioned in one seminary class as a resource for their reading. And I just was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. So yeah, I'd love to write more, but who knows? We'll have to see how that kind of shakes out.
Well, I have a feeling we've not heard the last from you yet, Donna.
And how you ended that then is a perfect sort of segue into the conclusion of your book, which I'd just like to read now in closing, because when you said that you got goosebumps holding these letters, I mean, isn't that amazing that these courageous, world-changing women who sowed the seeds of Methodism and carried the torch they never knew when they were writing that how many 100 years later, the Reverend Donna Fowler-Marchant would come visiting from the USA and write a book about them. That gives me goosebumps, you know. It's wonderful, it's marvelous how God works through them and is still at work through you. And so I just want to read in closing your conclusion, which says this: of all the praise heaped upon certain Methodist women after their deaths, nothing was more affectionate or significant than calling them mothers in Israel. To them we owe a debt of gratitude we cannot pay for their holy boldness, their stubborn obedience, their honest self-appraisal, and their wise spiritual counsel to the people called Methodists. It is my hope and prayer that this book will in some way, in some small way, be a down payment on that debt and serve as a remembrancer, in Mary Bosanquet Fletcher's words, of our need to imitate Christ as fearlessly and faithfully as did those mothers in Israel. Oh, I know David's clapping. It's a beautiful, you can hear it clap. It's a beautiful way, Donna, to end that book, and I feel as if that definitely is like a down payment on that debt. It's really wonderful. And so, friends listening today, friends listening to the recording, we've been chatting to the Reverend Donna Fowler-Marchant, author of Mothers in Israel, Methodist Beginnings Through the Eyes of Women. Please buy the book and spread the word, and request that your local libraries carry it. Because these are wonderful stories that need to be heard and need to be told. So we thank you again, Donna, for joining us, and it was just really wonderful to be with you, and thank you for what you wrote and what you will write. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a real joy to be here with you all.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Donna.